The Ice type, a type that was once a compelling choice in the early generation of Pokemon, due to the powerful Pokemon it inhibited, its wide array of super effective options, and the capability to counter the legendary heavy Dragon type. Immediately got exposed for all of its flaws, alongside its constant release of incompetent Pokemon that aren't able to match with the attributes the Ice type needed in order to thrive, and quickly got labeled off as a type that isn't worth using. So let's take a closer look at Ice, the type isolated by the numbers. We'll start by looking at the Ice type properties and how it has worsened despite it already not being that fearsome in the first place. When Ice first came out, it was super effective against 4 types and also able to resist only one, that being itself. On the negative side, 3 types are able to deal super effective damage against Ice, and 3 types are able to resist Ice type attacks. All in all, Ice type wasn't a good typing, but wasn't bad either, since it had a lot of super effective options. One of which was the Dragon type, which made Ice at the time the only type super effective against Dragon without being weak to Dragon itself. Of course, things won't stay that way. In Generation 2, we got introduced to the Steel typing, where not only is it able to resist the Ice type, since Steel resists almost everything anyways, it also deals super effective damage against Ice as well. Now at this point, the bad easily outweighs the good, and the Ice type best trait now is their effectiveness against a powerful Dragon type. But the Ice type hasn't reached its worst yet, as they received an indirect nerf in Generation 6 due to the introduction of the Fairy type. Now Ice is no longer the sole type super effective against Dragon without a Dragon weakness. In fact, it's been completely replaced, as both Fairy and Ice deal super effective damage to Dragon, but Fairy is completely immune to Dragon type attacks, while Ice receives neutral damage. It still remains a good offensive type, but due to everything else involved with the type, it's just better to choose a different typing who has at least some advantages on defense. Now, let's look at the strength and amount of Ice types that are being released over the generations. Just know the following calculation is only considering regular and regional forms, not megas or alternative forms. The Ice type had a very strong start in the initial generation of Kanto, where we were introduced with 5 Ice type Pokemon, all of which were fully evolved. This allowed the Ice type to have an average base stat value of 514. This amount allows it to lead against the averages of all types in the Kanto region. However, things instantaneously changes in the next generation of Johto. They also released an equal amount of Ice type Pokemon to Kanto at 5. However, of them, the only one that is fully evolved is Delibird, which isn't that good, which causes the Ice type in Johto to have the lowest average base stat total amongst final stage evolutions across all regions, alongside just in general the lowest average base stat total at 353 amongst all generations of Ice type Pokemon. This low value of 353 also allows Ice to have the second lowest base stat average total across all types in the Johto region, only being ahead of the Fairy type. But since Fairy didn't exist back then, that technically means Ice released the weakest set of Pokemon in Johto. Hoenn is up next, introducing 6 Ice type Pokemon, where we see the first 3-stage Ice type evolution line with Spheal, Celio, and Walrein, alongside the legendary Regice, which causes the Ice type in Hoenn to have an average base stat total of 432. The next region of Sinnoh also released 6 Ice type Pokemon as well, but with most of them being final stage evolution, which leads to the average base stat total to be 479, which is the second highest average Ice has ever received, only behind the Kanto region. Up next is Unova, which introduced 7 Ice types. This is tied for the record for most amount of Ice types released in a singular region, one of which was Kyurem, the Ice type Pokemon with the highest base stat total out of non-megas or alternate forms. In fact, there exist only 3 Icemons that exceed it when you are accounting for megas and alternative forms, 2 of which are Kyurem alternate forms themselves. Overall, the Unova region Ice type had an average base stat total of 460. Continuing on to Kalos, we see a total of 4 Ice types, which had an average base stat total of 425. I don't really got much to say about this one, but then we reach Alola, the region that introduced the fewest Ice type Pokemon in the Pokédex with only 1, which is the hideous looking Crabominable. Obviously, this makes the average base stat for Ice types 478, since that's Crabominable's stat total. After this, Galar comes out with 7 Ice type Pokemon to hopefully make up for what Alola lacked. This allows Galar to set a record for largest concentration of Ice type Pokemon out of any region, with 7 out of 96 Pokemon from Galar having the Ice typing. The average Ice type from Galar had a base stat of 463. Just know, Calyrex Ice Rider form isn't included for this because it's considered an alternate form. And finally, we reach Paldea, who also released 7 Ice type Pokemon, consisting of a pseudo-legendary, a legendary, and a paradox Pokemon, which allows the Paldea Ice type to have an average base stat of 477. When looking at only final stage Pokemon, Paldea had the highest average base stat total out of any region for Ice type at 565. All in all, after 9 generations of Pokemon, the Ice type comes out with an average base stat total of 454. When accounting for the 8 regional form Ice types as well, the score gets lowered to 448. This score allows Ice to place in 7th against all types on highest average base stat. Even when looking at all final stage Pokemon, it's tied in 7th with Dark at a score of 515. But there is one odd statistic that sheds some light on how the Ice type has diminished over the years. So let me briefly bring up power creep. As you might know in Pokemon, power creep is a way for new content to feel more fresh by making new released Pokemon stronger than the previous Pokemon, either by ability, moves, or stat increases. Looking at base stat total, the average Pokemon from Kanto had a base stat of 408, while Pokemon from Paldea had on average a base stat of 457, a very large increase. And if you needed more proof, these are the average stat total of every region. You can see a positive correlation between more stat over time, as the average base stat across all Pokemon went from 408 in Kanto to now 428 due to all the new introduced mons. So what does this have to do with the Ice type? Well, the thing is, when you look at the average stat total from a type's initial release point, so this is Steel and Dark during Generation 2 and Fairy during Generation 6, and you compare that average to the average stat they have in Paldea, you see that Ice is the only type whose average stat amongst Pokemon released in Generation 9 is lower than their initial start. Now, you could argue that Ice didn't have a singular pre-evolved Pokemon in Kanto, but did so in Paldea, which is the reason for this imbalance, and that I should be using only final stage forms for this particular calculation.
Poo-poo my words, fam? Nice that, Bucky. Do you know who you're dealing with, Close? Oh, lie, these random Gerbers got me teased. They found I catch a rude death on still.
Huh?
Anyways, that's enough about Ice type stats. Let's look at quantity. They released a very few amount of Ice types in Kanto, and this trend basically stayed the same throughout the series. In fact, throughout the generation, more Ice types has been releasing while fewer Pokemon has been releasing. This of course increases the overall rate at which we see Ice types from about 3% of all Pokemon from Kanto to almost 5% of all Pokemon now. A small increase, but an increase nonetheless. With the 8 regional forms as well, the percentage reaches 5.2%. Despite this desperate attempt to make the type more abundant, the Ice type ranks in last for least amount of Pokemon for a type, having only 56 Pokemon across regional and regular forms. And this isn't even the end for all the horrendous problems that the Ice type faces. Let's look at the Ice type intended playstyle versus their actual playstyle. Looking at Ice type properties, it's obviously built as a type that's supposed to play a glass cannon role, where it can defeat a lot of types and be defeated by a lot of types, with it having no way of protecting itself with its lack of resistances. But in reality, Ice types are mainly
Small and bulky.
despite the fact that it has no defensive properties that can help alongside those defensive stats. In fact, there exist 5 Ice type Pokemon that have a triple-digit speed stat and a triple-digit offensive stat. This is the least amount of Pokemons with such a requirement amongst all types. The second fewest is both Bug and Ground, who's both done it 8 times. So basically, due to the type's properties, it's bad defensively. And due to the Pokemon who are affiliated with the type, it on average is also bad offensively. And this isn't even the end of it for the Ice type. This type also has a low amount of reliable attacks. What I mean by this are good attacks with 100 accuracy. If you are an Ice type special attacker, you are only ever really using Ice Beam, the most famous attack for Ice, although this can be swapped with Freeze Dry, which in exchange for some damage allows it to be super effective against water. As for physical attacks, you only had Ice Punch, until this newest generation, which gave us Ice Spinner, which is just barely stronger. Outside of that, there are some stronger damage options for Ice, but none of those are guaranteed to give you higher damage output than the previously mentioned moves every single turn, unless of course, you have a skill in Cloyster or the Loaded Eye item when using Icicle Spear. Even looking at exclusive moves, only Glacial Lance has 100 accuracy. Every other exclusive Ice type attack has a chance to miss. Now, there's nothing wrong with the aforementioned Ice Beam or Ice Spinner, but when the type itself is solely reliant on what it can do on the offensive end, having these be your best reliable options just isn't gonna cut it. There's only one main aspect of battle left that the Ice type can hopefully rely on, and that's the help of other types to make up for a shortcoming in dual typing. There only exist 24 final stage dual type Ice Pokemon, but let's see if any of them are good ones. In Wolfie's video of all type combination, the worst 3 types that ice can be paired with is bug, grass, and rock. This combination is seen 4 times amongst final staged ice types. Just be glad it's not more than this, because they're all awful in battle. Now, looking at the good typing, the best 3 are ice fighting, ice electric, and ice ground. All of these types have only been used once, and as you probably all know, they are slow. The average speed across all final stage Pokemon is 78.7. When taking out all the bummy mons out, so for this particular condition will be Pokemon whose average stat total is below 450. When those are removed, the average speed stat is 80.2, which is higher than the speed of all 3 ice Pokemon that have a good typing. Commendable is absolutely
useless and ugly.
Dracozolt can only ever see some use when it's using its Slush Rush ability. And Mamoswine, that one was pretty decent nonetheless, since it had the singular best ice dual typing with respectable stats. However, the passage of time slowly decreased its effectiveness and it's no longer seen as a great threat. Although, I do think Omega could easily revert it back to its glory days. But outside of just Mamoswine, the ice type had no luck when creating good dual type Pokemon. Now, what the ice type does have is a weather condition. Hail in the first 7 generations and snow in the last 2 generations. These weather conditions are needed to activate some abilities and moves. But outside of that, what are the benefits of having it? Hail prevented ice type from being damaged by the weather, while snow gave ice types 50% more defense. It's better than nothing, but it's widely worse than its weather counterpart of Sandstorm, which affects not 1 but 3 types, all of which are prevented from Sandstorm damage and gain 50% more special defense simultaneously. And since these 3 types don't share a common weakness, it's actually a viable option to create a team fully compromised of those buffed by Sandstorm. But as for ice, you can't solely rely on the weather to carry you in a mono ice type team due to the countless amount of flaws they already have. But how does all of this lead to ice type roles in a competitive standpoint? Can they still do something of importance even with all these drawbacks? Just know, the data collected for this part is from Pikalytics and it was extracted April 13th, 2025. Pokemon's usages could have increased or decreased from when you are watching this video. Let's start by looking at the Uber tier. The only ice type that ranks in the top 25 for usage rate is Calyrex Ice Rider form. This is due to the insane stats it has while it's inside Trick Room, allowing it to be one of the deadliest offensive Pokemon in the Uber tier. However, even with that, it only ranks in 10th. Due to the sheer number of weaknesses it has on the defensive end. The next closest ice type was Kyurem Black, who ranked in 29th, relying fully on hyper offense with Dragon Dance and Loaded Eye Icicle Spear. For a Pokemon to be one of the greats in Uber tier, they need one of the following alongside good stats. Either support, such as Koraidon's ability to start Sun every time it enters the field, good defensive typing, such as Kyogre and Zacian Crown form, or the ability to recover health, such as Ho-Oh, Necrozma Duskmane, and Eternatus. Calyrex is the only ice-type Pokemon to exist that meets one of these criteria, with his Trick Room move being able to support slow Pokemon such as itself. So, until another ice-type is able to meet these standards, they're most likely not going to be seen much in this legendary heavy format. Now, let's look at OU. Despite it just being the Uber format without the heavy hitters, it's met with the same situation. Kyurem and Weavile are the only 2 ice-type to rank in the top 30 for usage rate, in which they rank 20th and 27th respectively. No other ice type has a usage rate of at least 3% in OU. In the monotype format, which is a format that requires you to only use one type, the top 3 most used ice types are Mamoswine, Kyurem, and Articuno, who ranks in 30th, 32nd, and 34th. These ranks aren't bad. However, none of these 3 Pokemon recommended team is ice. The highest ranked ice Pokemon that is recommended to be on an ice type team is Weavile, who's ranked in 97th for usage rate at 1.38%. As expected, teams that are mono ice aren't sought after. The reason for this, as mentioned countless of times in this video, is possibly due to their lack of defensive properties, allowing them to be easy targets to defeat. But what if they played in a format which mitigated the overall effectiveness of defenses, such as double battles, where Pokemon are much more susceptible to face a Pokemon that can deal super effective damage against them, regardless of typing, thus making doubles format a more offensively orientated format. You know, something that the ice type actually has. Ice is seen 3 times in the top 25, one of which is Chien Pao, who ranks in 2nd overall for usage rate, being in almost 1/3 of all teams. And the combined usage rate of all ice type Pokemon in the top 25 is over 50%. This is vastly greater than the combined usage rate of ice types in the top 50 in OU singles, with a more than double usage rate. Even when looking at the current regulation set G showdown stats, we see it having 2 placements in the top 10 for usage rate. This top 10 is not only proof that ice performs well in doubles, but that bad defensive typings also aren't as impeded as much. As in this top 10, only 5 types see multiple usage in the top 10. Ice, Fire, Dark, Psychic, who all had 2 appearances, and somehow Grass, which leads them all with 3 appearances, despite having the record for most number of weaknesses for a singular type. All in all, the double format gives a window for the ice type Pokemon to finally show their worth as a suitable offensive option. But what do you guys think? Can Game Freak turn this type's reputation around with Pokemon that are actually built like glass cannons, or new megas that will be released in ZA? Or will it only ever have a very limited amount of usage due to the lack of competent Pokemon and overall benefits to remain the type isolated by the numbers?